Hi everyone, and welcome to Let's Define Shadow Work Part 2, the Psyche. Let's see, so last video I defined what shadow work is and ultimately said shadow work is looking deep at the unconscious self so we can reflect, accept, and release the less than ideal parts of ourselves. Today I want to understand the psyche, which has to do a lot with our unconscious self, so we know what to reflect on. So today we are just focusing on reflection in a non-judgmental way, and we're going to talk about Carl Jung's belief with the psyche and Freud's belief with the ego, and combo them all together, talk a little bit about anxiety and guilt and how that's related to our psyche. And then I have a few questions for you to think on and journal over, and then that's it. So let's see. Jung believed exploring the psyche was helpful for personal growth in order to become more authentically the self, which makes me ask the question, what is authentic, what is the psyche, and what is non-judgmental, which is kind of my own take on this whole thing, is to be non-judgmental. It's a DBT thing. So if you look up in existentialist philosophy, the concept of being authentic is relating to or denoting an emotionally appropriate, significant, purposeful, and responsible mode of human life. If we look at the dictionary, it states to be authentic means to be based on facts, accurate, or reliable. So if we are looking to become more authentically reliable with ourselves, we need to understand the unconscious self. We want to understand it factually, what's going on, and not to assign judgment to it. We don't want to gloss over anything, right? We're trying to actually look at things, get into it, understand what's going on in our brain so that we can understand our behaviors, we can understand our morals, we can understand our judgments, everything. So, okay, to be authentic is like factual, accurate. That might be a good definition as well. The psyche is to be an authentic part of our psyche. We have to first know what the psyche is. The psyche is the inner world of our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Carl Jung believed the psyche was made up of the conscious and unconscious selves, where Freud theorized that these were influenced both consciously and subconsciously by the id, ego, and superego. So in order to understand the psyche, we need to understand all those things. So the conscious self is what is aware of thoughts and experiences. Examples of things that the conscious self is responsible for is like logic, having a filter, analysis, movement, decision making, short term memory, willpower, critical thinking, that type of thing. The unconscious self is thoughts, feelings, and experiences that are repressed. So, examples that can lead to unconscious behavior include habits, patterns, emotions, also things like bodily functions, beliefs, desires, blame, denial, lying, attachment to things, and that type of thing. So, if we're exploring the unconscious mind, and it can lead to a deeper understanding of our motivations, reactions, and behaviors, so we can make changes to these that will become conscious behaviors to be more authentically ourselves. How do we know what we don't know? It's a great question, and this is where the id, ego, and superego come into play. So let's define those real quick. The id is the self with urges and impulse without control. Think of a baby. It has no morals, rationale, anxiety, fear, or guilt. The id is your baby self. You respond to basic urges like food, water, and shelter. The id does not comprehend objective reality. It is pleasure-seeking, chaotic, and unreasonable. There's nothing inherently wrong with the id until you introduce the ego and the superego, and you'll see why in a second. As your ego develops, this is the part of yourself that introduces rational thought, decision-making, problem-solving, etc. The ego compromises with the id to get the urges and impulses that the id needs, but in a socially acceptable and safe way. So when we introduce the ego, we're introducing social constructs. And this is part of what we'll talk about later too, in a minute. But also note that it introduces a lot of anxiety, because when your ego and your id are not aligned, you have something off socially that you're supposed to be doing or not doing or whatever, and that's when you get anxiety. It also doesn't talk about morality yet. We introduce morality when we introduce the superego. So the introduction of superego would be when it's the internalized social ideals and places judgment over what is moral and immoral. The superego motivates behavior according to the morals you have internalized. When your behavior is out of line between the superego and ego, we get guilt. The superego can also inform what you ought to be doing, such as aspirations and behaviors. So, the more we are aware of the reasons behind the unconscious behaviors, the more we can align our conscious self to the unconscious self to be more authentic. That is a lot. I have some questions for you in a minute, but let's first look at being authentic and looking at our conscious and subconscious self in a non-judgmental way. And that's a DBT word. It's pretty simple, and it just says to observe events, thoughts, behaviors, feelings, etc., without labeling them as inherently good or bad. So essentially, take away the superego, take away that for now. We're just looking at things not from a good or bad standpoint, but from a need or want standpoint, and very factually. So, okay, here's my questions for you, and they kind of go in layers for you to think about when looking at your psyche and trying to map out and explore your conscious and subconscious or unconscious selves and where your ego, id, and superego lie. First of all, what's is the conscious and unconscious self? If you're listening to the video, you should be able to get a pretty good idea. And just for recap, the conscious self is basically the part of you that is aware, and the unconscious self is the part of you that is repressed, of your thoughts, feelings, experiences, etc. What is the id, ego, and superego? The id is basically your baby self. It's your urges and impulses. The ego is the part of yourself that introduces rational thought, introduces social constructs, and introduces anxiety. And the superego introduces morality to your behaviors and ideas and thoughts, and places judgment over what is moral and immoral. So then I want you to think about, what are your basic needs? Think about your id. What do you need? I know I need food, water, shelter, etc. You can think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you could Google real quick if you need to. MASLOW, Maslow, hierarchy of needs. It'll give you a good idea. That little bottom layer is your id, essentially. What are your wants? That's your ego, and that's for you to define. I could give you some examples. I want to be comfortable in life, right? I want, I don't just, I need nutrition. I want macaroni and cheese or pizza, right? But like ramen noodles would provide some sort of nutrition as well, so my belly wasn't hungry. So think about your wants. And then in relation to the two, think about your anxieties and how do your anxieties impact your wants. Think about, where do these anxieties come from? Is it society? Is it your parents? Is it school? Is it because of the location that you live? Like I'm in Missouri. Does that impact my anxieties differently than if I were to live in California, for example? Probably. There's probably examples. And then think about when these anxieties show up. Do I always get anxious going to the bank? Well, why do I get anxious going to the bank? What is it about the bank that makes me anxious? Is it the standing and waiting? Is it because I don't like banks? Why do I like banks? Is it always show up at 4 o'clock or 4:30? Why? What happens at 4:30 or at 5? Maybe half an hour before, after. And so I want you to explore your anxieties a little bit this week. How they impact your wants, where do they come from, and when do they show up? And then the other thing I want you to, the other two things I want you to explore is your moral standards. And again, we're not judging anything. We're not saying it's good or bad. We're just, what are our morals? Because we're thinking of the superego, and we're trying to understand ourselves a little better unconsciously. So list our morals, figure out where they came from. Again, society, parents, school, where you're located, etc. And then think on the fact that when the morals you have don't match the morals you want to have, no, that's when your superego and ego are not aligned. And you can explore that by asking why you have certain morals, who taught you them, and what your current morals are. And that'll help with a lot of disconnect in the brain. And then the last thing I want you to think about is guilt. So, what are my guilts? Where do I feel guilt? And why is that guilt there? Who does that guilt come from? And again, it's like the guilt is the same with the anxiety. When it mismatches between your superego and ego and it's not aligned, you're going to have guilt. And that's okay. It's just, we're just exploring what that guilt is, where it comes from, why it's there, etc. So that's my video for today. Next week, I'm going to get into how we think with mind traps, black and white thinking, and other ways of thinking consciously and unconsciously, while exploring guilt and anxiety a little bit more under this id, ego, and superego construct with the psyche. And then what I want you to do this week is answer the questions I posed here, and then work with it with a therapist if you have a therapist. But also put a self-care plan together for your guilt and anxiety. So when you start exploring these things, you can start to feel like really uneasy and uncomfortable because we're like us analyzing what is like mismatched in our brain. So it's important to do self-care. Always do self-care after you've explored these things. So for example, I know that part of my self-care plan is bubble baths, herbal joints, and manga. So I knew this was going to be a tough week. It's already been a tough week, and I made sure to have all those on stock. I also have other self-care plans in place using various DBT skills, which we'll get into at some point in these videos. But yeah, just make sure you take care of yourself and explore anxiety, explore guilt, explore morality, explore your basic needs and wants. That's all I have for you. Okay, bye.